And now I would like to hand over to John Leary, senior researcher from Loughborough University, working for the MECS program, who was also our focal point and the coordinator of the studies that were carried out in the EnDev countries. John, over to you.
Thank you, Verena, and thank you to you and your team for all that you've put into these studies, for the invitation to present here today. It's delightful to be able to see this culmination of a huge amount of work that we've done together over the past 6 months, and to really gain a much deeper understanding of the market for electric cooking in 8 of the countries that interest us most. So my name is John Leary. As Verena mentioned, I'm a senior researcher with the MECS program. I'm based here in Nairobi in Kenya, and delighted to be joined by many of my colleagues from MECS, who will be presenting the studies that they've been working on later in the presentation today. So we have Iwana Bisaga, who's going to be presenting the findings from the Rwanda study. We have Susan Stritska. If her internet connection holds out, she'll be presenting the results from Benin. Vimbai Chabungu will be presenting the Uganda study. Richard Seif, Ethiopia. And then Melinda Banatalia, who bravely took on 2 countries and will be presenting Nepal and Bangladesh. And then we have Professor Matt Leach, who has taken time out of his day teaching today to share with us the impact modeling.
That's what they basically be.
Sorry, if you wouldn't mind muting the mic, thank you. So Matt Leach will be presenting the impact modeling, both the methodology and the results at the other part of the session. So let me move on to the overview of the session today. I'll begin by giving a bit of a context around electric cooking, why we're so excited about it, why we chose to do these market assessments, which I think Verena has already alluded to, the approach we took, and then going into detail for each of these country studies, looking at the key findings, the opportunities and the challenges for electric cooking in these 8 different, but at the same time similar contexts. Then we'll look across the countries and we'll look at some of the emerging trends and the corresponding recommendations that we made for strategic interventions. Finally, we'll close with some key takeaways. Also, I'd like to note that I've put in the chat a link to a blog which we published just today, which links to all of the other country studies and follows a similar narrative to the presentation that we're giving today. So if you would like to find out more, if you're very interested in one country in particular, please do click that link and go and find the full reports in detail there. So MECS, what is it? MECS stands for Modern Energy Cooking Services. It is a 5-year, £40 million UK government-funded research and innovation programme. It's designed to enable the 3 billion people around the world today who still cook primarily with biomass to transition directly to cooking with modern energy. So we use a variety of mechanisms to do this. They include innovation challenge funds with the private sector, country partnerships with local organisations that have a deep understanding of the context in which they're based. We have a partnership with the World Bank, specifically with the ESMAP team. And we have thematic work streams such as behaviour change and scale up. We also have a core aim of changing the narrative in the clean cooking and electrification sectors. We want to do this by integrating cooking into the planning and implementation for modern energy more broadly. And I think a great example of this is the initiative that the EnDev team have taken to combine the forces of their energy access teams, their electricity access teams and clean cooking teams to create the eCooking team that we see represented here today. So that's fantastic and something we would like to see in institutions around the world. There are a range of modern energy cooking technologies in scope for the MECS programme, but we do have a big focus on electric cooking in particular. Why? Well, we see a huge opportunity to leverage the massive progress that's been made globally in electrification to drive forward the clean cooking agenda. So what you see on the graph on the right hand side here in yellow above is progress in electrification. You can see we're almost on track for the 2030 SDG targets, whereas with clean cooking, we're likely to fall far behind. And now what we see with the increasing access, reliability, and in many contexts, high renewable energy shares on grid electricity and off-grid systems, we see an opportunity to use this massive progress to drive forward what has been a much slower moving sector, the clean cooking sector. We now see a broad range of energy efficient appliances available on the market, such as the induction stove, the infrared stove, the rice cooker, insulated electric frying pan, or the EPC, the electric pressure cooker. So these new modern appliances connect into the aspirational, they offer an aspirational cooking experience that connects into broader societal trends that we're seeing across low and middle income countries today, including urbanization and modernization. So we see this as something that can rapidly scale in the same way that we see mobile phones and mobile money rapidly go from virtually zero penetration to almost ubiquity in many countries over the past few decades. So there are new business models and technologies which can now break down the high upfront cost of, in particular, energy efficient appliances. And they can deliver electric cooking services to households, and not just with strong grid connections, but those with more unreliable grid connectivity, and even those in off-grid areas. So what we see in the diagram here in the top left, this is conventional electric cooking. Get your appliance from the store, plug it into a reliable grid, there you go, you're good to cook. Well, what if your grid is not available for part or all of the day? Well, you can use energy storage, for example, a household battery, in order to buffer that unreliability, cook when you want, and charge the battery when the grid wants to. Or you can use an off-grid system and a similar configuration to the popular solar home system, scaled up a little in terms of power capacity and energy storage to be able to power the cooking appliances. Or you can simply plug a solar panel directly into the solar, to a DC cooking appliance and cook when the sun is available, or when you have enough thermal storage available to be able to continue cooking. So as Verena mentioned in the introduction, then these market assessments are part of a series of joint publications. You can find the 8 country studies in full detail in the blog that's linked to in the chat. We wanted to, in these studies, look across the clean cooking and electricity access sectors and assess the current state of the market and the current connections between these two sectors. This is something we really prioritize in the MECS program, having seen the existence of this siloed working with electricity access over here and clean cooking over here, and some people now starting to join the dots and connect these two together. We looked at 8 countries across sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Why did we choose these countries? Well, these are countries where the local EnDev teams had expressed an interest in carrying out electric cooking projects in the coming year. So this is where teams on the ground had seen an opportunity, and where the EnDev eCooking team really wanted to gain a deeper understanding of what the current market situation was like, so they can understand where are the opportunities for strategic intervention that can support the development of the electric cooking market in those countries, bearing in mind the nuances of the context. So once again, I'd like to thank the huge number of people who have contributed to these studies. We have the EnDev eCooking team represented by Simona, Gregor and Verena. We have the MECS link researchers and the workstream leads, many of whom are here today and who I'd mentioned earlier, and who led these individual country studies in the context that they are most familiar with. And then we have both the EnDev and the MECS country teams, without whom we would not have been able to really connect our desk study with the reality on the ground. So we really appreciate the input you've given to these studies and helping us to validate what we had seen in our desk research, and really give context to what we've been putting together. So thank you to everyone for your collaboration. So the approach we used, as I mentioned, it's a desk study, collating findings from existing studies and drawing upon the knowledge and expertise of the local teams. We do have a framework for analysis, which again is linked to in the blog in the chat. We use the guiding research questions of what is the market potential for electric cooking in each country? on what are the key opportunities and challenges for either piloting or scaling up grid-connected or off-grid electric cooking. We used the 3 dimensions from the MECS transition theory of change to frame the analysis. We looked at the enabling environment, where we carried out an integrated policy analysis. What do I mean by this? I mean, looking at the connections between the clean cooking and electricity access sectors. Are they just 2 very different spheres? Is electrification policy over here and clean cooking over here? Or are they starting to be woven together in an integrated policy environment? We looked at consumer demand, including a culinary compatibility analysis. This involved asking the local teams to map out what a weekly menu would typically look like for someone in their country, grouping the foods, the similar dish types together, and then trying to evaluate the compatibility of each type of dish with the range of modern energy efficient electric appliances that are currently available. And then we looked at the supply chain. This included the relative costs, looking at the relative costs of different cooking fuels and comparing them to electricity, and looking at the import data where available, so we can understand what kind of appliances are being brought into each of these countries and understand the current state of the supply chain. So I'm going to pass over very briefly here to Matt Leach. He's going to give an introduction to the impact modelling that he'd carried out. Matt, over to you.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so for doing the impact modelling, we adopted the newly revised open source model by the WHO, BARHAP. It supports and is intended for scenario modelling for transitions in cooking from traditional fuels to a range of modern cooking options, including eCooking. The model itself is preloaded with data on a wide range of low and middle income countries, as well as starting assumptions for the different cooking options. For our work, we tweaked that model a little bit and we changed some of the assumptions to be able to better represent the kind of eCooking we're interested in particular electric pressure cookers. We filled in data gaps and we added some additional reporting and results to suit the outcomes we were looking for. We applied the model, so the model calculates the direct costs and the physical impacts of the transition you're modeling, and then it also monetizes those and discounts those financial values to arrive at a net social cost. We applied the model for the 8 countries, in each case with a scenario that was chosen to represent a transition from one key market segment, currently using either charcoal or firewood, to using eCooking. And for that eCooking, we were assuming and modelling a combination of an EPC plus a hot plate, stacking with a small amount of the original fuel. And we were looking at a transition over the period to 2030. Our scenarios were fairly conservative. We weren't assuming 100% transition, but they were set to be broadly consistent with MECS's broad set goal that by 2030, we want to see 40% of households with an electricity supply using it for cooking, and 60% of households that are using modern energy for cooking using a low carbon energy source. So we applied that thinking to our selected segments in each country. I'll give a brief overview of the impact results after the presentations about the market outlook for each of the countries, which follows now.
Great, thank you, Matt. So onto the national level market outlooks. I'll begin with the country that I know best, that's Kenya. So Kenya is a hotbed for innovation in the development sector. It's the birthplace of mobile money. Many of the new electric cooking technologies and business models that we're piloting in the MECS program are being piloted here in Kenya, benefiting from the strong ecosystem of actors and the enabling environments in what we see as the converging clean cooking and electrification sectors. So Kenya has made really enormous progress on electrification, increasing from just 19% to over 75% in just 10 years. What you can see in this graph in the top left here is a plot of the historical trends in electricity access in purple and clean cooking access in blue. You see that rapid progress by the steep line in purple, and you see the aspirations for achieving universal access to both by 2030, which in fact the Kenyan government would like to do that by even earlier, universal access to electricity by this year. Which seems ambitious, but nice to set an ambitious goal. and clean cooking by 2028, which given the slope of that curve also seems ambitious. But what we look at here is really the gap between the two of them. I've highlighted there 55% of the population now have access to electricity, but still primarily cook with polluting fuels. So there's really a huge opportunity here to drive forward the clean cooking agenda and help it to catch up with that enormous progress that's been made in electrification. Most of Kenya's electricity comes from renewable sources, mainly geothermal and hydro, but the vast majority of the population still rely upon polluting fuels, in particular firewood, charcoal and kerosene for cooking. So currently 0% of the population use electricity as their primary cooking fuel, meaning that there's an enormous untapped potential, which is increasingly drawing interest from both public, private sector, as well as consumers. So as you can see on the right here, there's a formidable clean cooking challenge. In fact, slightly more progress has been made than this would suggest, as there is now more recent census data that's been published, showing that gas has actually reached a much larger proportion of the population. But the trend still continues, and the majority of the population cook with polluting fuels. And there are large market segments who are cooking with what we call commercialized polluting fuels. So what we mean by this is that they are fuels that are almost always paid for. These include charcoal and kerosene, and in some contexts, mineral coal as well. So these are particularly attractive targets for conversion to electric cooking, because we know there's an existing expenditure out there, and it's a much more attractive proposition to convert this existing expenditure into electricity units and repayments on a finance energy efficient appliance than to get someone who's currently collecting firewood or dung or crop waste to start paying for their cooking fuel in the form of electricity. So as you can see, there are major challenges in terms of health, deforestation and climate change that are caused by this dependence on polluting fuels for cooking. Women and girls, of course, are disproportionately affected. There's greater exposure to cooking smoke, and the drudgery of collecting the fuels and tending the fires results in missed opportunities. Improved cook stoves, or ICS, have been heavily promoted in Kenya, but sustainable uptake has been challenging. LPG is already the aspirational fuel for many and has seen substantial uptake throughout the country, mainly in urban areas. However, electricity is commonly perceived as too expensive for cooking, even though recent evidence is showing that a clean fuel stack of LPG and an efficient electric device, such as the electric pressure cooker, can often be the most cost-effective solution. So we're pleased to say that policymakers in Kenya are seeing the opportunity for integrated planning, and there is now an electric cooking strategy, which is in development, which we are also proud to be able to collaborate with the EnDev team on. But this framework is not yet in place. As you'll see in some of the other countries, they have already seen that opportunity and developed integrated policy. So in Kenya, then the opportunity that we see for electric cooking is, as you see on the right here, this graph shows the electricity generation mix. And as you can see, most of it is green, indicating that most of Kenya's electricity comes from renewable sources. And it doesn't just depend on hydro, it has a diversified mix of renewable generation. There's enormous potential here. What we see is a potentially transformative opportunity for Kenya to break out of this business as usual cycle and to use this massive progress on electrification, with 3/4 of the country now connected, to drive forward the clean cooking agenda. Our preliminary research and piloting has shown that the electric pressure cooker in particular is highly compatible with the popular heavy foods such as beans that are frequently cooked in Kenya. Kenya's national utility, Kenya Power, are actively stimulating demand for its almost exclusively renewable electricity, and have launched in 2017 or relaunched their Pika na Power or Cook with Electricity program as part of this. A big challenge for them has been the last mile electrification program, which is the source of that massive progress in electricity access. But unfortunately, many of the new customers they connected in rural and low-income urban areas have very low electricity demand. So they're bringing in limited additional revenue for the company. So Kenya does have a rich history, as you've seen, of progress in the energy sector. In particular, it's the market leader for solar home system sales in sub-Saharan Africa. Modern energy cooking technologies such as LPG are already widely adopted. And this progress has laid the groundwork for the goal of achieving universal energy access, not just by, but ahead of the 2030 SDG targets. So on that note, I would like to pass over to our next presenter, who is Iwona Bisaga, who is going to take us through the market outlook for electric cooking in Rwanda. Iwona, over to you.
Thank you very much, John, and thanks everyone for being here. I'll be covering our study of Rwanda, and it will be presented in a similar format to that John just presented on Kenya. So in Rwanda, what we've seen over the last decade is a relatively strong economic growth, and a favorable environment for new businesses, and that goal of the Rwandan government of really working towards lifting people out of poverty. The government are working towards economic development and various reforms in the financial and business sectors, and it's sort of demonstrated, particularly in creating that environment for businesses to thrive in the country, moving up from number 139 to 38 on the annual World Bank Doing Business report between 2010 and 2018. And there has been a lot of progress in electrification. As you can see, it's gone up from approximately 10% in 2010 to around 67 in 2021, and it continues to go up through both grid and off-grid electrification. The current generation capacity is approximately 236 megawatts, and the government are actively working towards sort of sparking and triggering more demand for electricity consumption. So that also presents an opportunity for electric cooking. Approximately 11% of the generation is imported, and you can see the sort of mix of generation in Rwanda. Most people, however, still rely on polluting fuels, and that's predominantly charcoal in urban areas and firewood in rural areas. And as of today, 0% cook with electricity as their primary fuel. However, the Rwandan cuisine, similar to that in Kenya, is highly compatible with electric appliances, such as electric pressure cookers and rice cookers, and that, again, is a huge opportunity. And there is interest expressed by both the government of Rwanda and the private sector, but so far there's relatively little evidence, and that's something that we're looking to change. And there are colleagues here on the call from Energy for Impact who have been doing some studies that will hopefully generate very valuable insights to inform the sector. So if we move to the next slide, please. Regarding the clean cooking challenge, I mean, as already mentioned, majority of the population still rely on biomass, and that stands that biomass consumption is at approximately 85%, and out of the total consumption, households are by far the major consumers. So reducing that reliance of firewood and making cooking, even with firewood, more efficient is a huge priority for the Rwandan government, given that the rates of deforestation and degradation of natural resources has been very high over the last years. And of course, there are other impacts, again, similar to Kenya, with women and girls being heavily affected by the drudgery that comes with firewood collection and procurement of other fuels, as well as long cooking times. Sustainable uptake of improved cook stoves, which have been heavily promoted over the last decades, really, particularly in rural areas, has been challenging as well. And while promoted, there are still sort of models that are being worked on that can prove sustainable, and that includes both improved cook stoves for firewood consumption, but also for briquettes and pellets that are a priority for the government. And LPG is heavily promoted in urban areas. It is already aspirational for many, and while the uptake has been quite sort of steady over the years, it has been affected by the recent fluctuations in international markets, and possibly sort of setting back households to go back to biomass. Low income remains a challenge. Affordability and sort of the capacity to pay of households, particularly in rural areas, is something that needs to be considered, and certainly there will be the need for sort of financing and schemes that will facilitate uptake. Electricity is commonly perceived as too expensive to cook with. That has sort of historical roots. And again, that evidence that we're aiming to generate will hopefully inform the sector and prove that it can be a feasible sort of cooking fuel that is cost competitive with other commonly used fuels. Tariffs remain relatively high for sort of the lower end consumers. And that again presents an opportunity to work with the government of to consider tariff breaks for those who uptake electric cooking. And as such, there is still a relatively low awareness and low availability of electric cooking appliances, particularly the super energy efficient ones, such as electric pressure cookers and rice cookers. And then finally, sort of covering again the some of the opportunities that exist. There is a very ambitious target of reducing the biomass consumption rate from 83% to 42% by 2024. So looking at the next 2 years, and the initiatives that the government are supporting include LPG for urban areas, but also biogas, electricity, and improved cook stoves. Universal clean cooking access is expected to be reached by 2030, or so is the goal. The nationally determined contributions also sort of cover modern efficient cook stoves and aim to reach 80% of rural and 50% of urban population by 2030. The high access to relatively stable and reliable grid connection in urban areas presents a great opportunity for the electric cooking sector. And increase sort of private sector interest in this space. We have seen over the last couple of years really sort of a number of studies that have looked at electric cooking. One of them is the MECS supported Energy for Impact study. Electrocook have set up in Rwanda. They're looking to promote EPCs, and they're also running pilots with Arc Power, who are a mini grid provider. The inclusion of eCooking in one of the largest RBFs to date under the Rwanda Energy Access and Quality Improvement Project, the Window 3B, is a big one. However, it perhaps hasn't been given as much attention as it deserves, and it does sort of include the electric cooking appliances as well. But awareness of that is relatively low. And finally, there is a strong sort of ecosystem for innovation and for businesses and for the private sector to really sort of thrive in that political will for change. So again, something to capitalize on. Thank you so much, and I'll be handing over to Melinda.
Thank you, Melinda. Thank you, Ivana. Over to you, Melinda.
Yeah, I haven't gone yet. Thanks very much, Owen and John. I'll be presenting Bangladesh and then moving rapidly into Nepal, if that's all right. I just want to point out I don't have access to the chat for some reason, so if there are any questions, I will pick them up after the presentation and get back to anyone if they just leave their email address in the chat along with the comments. Right, so Bangladesh, if we jump to the first slide, please, John. Bangladesh became a low middle income country in John, it's not changed. Oh, there we go. Thanks. In 2015, and is one of the most densely populated countries in the world with over 160 million people, 64% of which live in rural areas. Now, the country has made rapid progress towards universal electrification. As we see on the graph there, 99% of the population have access to electricity. However, 77% still lack access to clean cooking. This is partly because clean cooking isn't currently prioritized by the national government and doesn't connect with electrification policy. So grid electricity is very cheap though, but it is still unreliable. And despite surplus electricity on the grid as a whole, several regions still experience severe load shedding. And also only 2% of that electricity is renewable. However, Bangladesh has become a world leader on the mini-grid and off-grid scenarios, or they're ranked 8th and 4th respectively, according to the MECS eCooking GMA. However, biomass remains a popular choice, especially in the rural areas. As I said, that is 64% of the population, so it's a considerable figure. gas, both PNG and LPG are already widely adopted, but eCooking is gaining in popularity, but it isn't the primary cooking option. It still remains a complementary source. Next slide, please, John. So clean cooking and cooking with electricity specifically is not supported at policy level, as I've said already, and there are a multiplicity of barriers to the uptake. These have been identified at both supply and demand ends, and they include poor perceptions, which are due to socio-cultural reasons, a lack of awareness, and concerns around affordability. Now, Bangladesh has the lowest access to clean cooking fuels and technologies in Southeast Asia, as already mentioned, with around 77% of the population lacking access to clean cooking. Fuel stacking is common, with around 75% of the population or households stacking firewood with other biomass fuels. That breaks down to roughly 62.4% in urban households and 77.5% in rural households. There are issues around the unavailability of after-sales services. So, for example, repair and maintenance, those issues persist. And Bangladesh is highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Sorry, I can hear interference. Ranking 76 out of 77 countries in terms of climate resilience. Now, that means that forest loss is an issue, with around 50% of wood fuel harvested being unsustainable. So if we move on to the next slide, please, John. The opportunity for eCooking in Bangladesh, as I said, there is a very low proportion of which is, if you look at the graph on the side, is 1.5% is renewably generated. However, there's a 40 to 45% surplus power generation. Now, currently, there is a development of a national action plan for clean cooking, which is underway, and that has the ambitious goal of 100% clean cooking by 2030. That is currently being developed by Schrader in collaboration with Practical Action and MECS, and also the government of Bangladesh. Local companies are equally committed to addressing poor perceptions of the e-cooking appliance sector, and that they're doing so by reducing prices and increasing accessibility. Our own MECS research by the UIU in Dhaka have found that the cost of e-cooking for a family of 6 is considerably lower than LPG and firewood. So that would be 600 taka versus 800 taka per month, as is seen there. And additional research has also shown that it is possible to implement low-cost integration of photovoltaic in households, which would reduce monthly costs of cooking. Now, there's a highly active mini-grid and off-grid energy sector, which we could take advantage of, and the recent expansion of the national grid and generation capacity will have a negative economic impact on utilities if consumption does not increase. Right, so I think that takes us to very quickly onto Nepal. So the government of Nepal has adopted an integrated electrification or clean cooking approach, with the 2020 NDC target of 25% of all households using electricity as a primary mode of cooking by 2030. And they already have a dedicated e-cooking tariff that has been deployed. As I said, the country has made massive strides in the electrification, with current access close to 95%, with 71.7% of households being grid connected and 23% have off-grid connection. The government of Nepal announced the Decade of Energy and Hydropower to realize the dream of a prosperous Nepal, happy Nepal, and that's aimed at providing universal electricity access by 2022. Yet 52.4% of households still rely on firewood as their main fuel for cooking. That's 35.4% across urban households and 65.8% in rural. And currently 0.4% of Nepali households use electricity as their primary cooking fuel. Now, the country's increase in investment in renewable energy capacity and the expected surplus capacity means that cooking with electricity is most certainly a viable option and will increasingly become so, particularly for those connected to the grid. And as we see then the final point, in 2020/21, the government of Nepal's AEPC aimed to promote e-cooking in 100,000 households, and the NEA have launched a dedicated e-cooking tariff. Next slide, please, John. Thanks. So despite near universal access to electricity, quality and reliability of electricity supply remains a key issue. Unfortunately, that means that less than 1% of Nepali households primarily cook with electricity. And you see that on the graph on the right. Households continue to rely heavily on freely available solid biomass firewood and cow dung or plant residue as a cooking fuel. And clean energy sources such as LPG or electricity are still perceived to be expensive as a result. There are also issues around the unavailability of after-sales services or repair and maintenance. Those issues and perceptions persist. And yeah, I think I've already mentioned, the issues around quality and reliability that remain. So the opportunities for e-cooking in Nepal, excuse me, the government of Nepal are committed to addressing policy for an integrated approach of electricity and clean cooking throughout as a combined sector. They have the dedicated e-cooking tariff in place already. There's expected surplus generation capacity. Most mini grids are hydropowered, which means more appropriate than solar for electric cooking. And there's a large body of ongoing and past research that shows that the country's increasing investment in renewable generation capacity and expected surplus capacity means that cooking with electricity is a viable option. Yeah, I think that is us for Nepal, John. And I will pass on to, I think it's Vimbai for Uganda.
Yeah, thank you, Melinda. Over to you, Vimbai.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'll just summarize Uganda. So despite historically low electrification rates, e-cooking is becoming an increasingly viable and scalable option. So about 24% now have access to the grid and 27 are off-grid. And there has been a significant investment in generation capacity, which has helped to mitigate against relying purely on hydropower. This was based on a sort of drought-induced load shedding and power outages that happened in 2005. There's a total installed generation capacity that has doubled from 600 to 1,200 megawatts. That was from 2010 and 2019. So now that means that there is actually a surplus demand, almost double, and utilities such as UMEMI are proactively stimulating demand, predominantly renewable access such as electricity. So 21% use charcoal as their primary cooking fuel. However, intensive charcoal production is depleting forests, and the population is set to double by 2050, so that could have dire effects. So as a result, the government of Uganda has put in an array of policies that target to facilitate the transition away from biomass and onto clean fuels. Next slide, please. So the cleaning cooking challenges in Uganda is that, so as mentioned, the vast majority do use firewood and charcoal, which is 21% for charcoal, and only about 0.4% are currently using electricity. And the intensive charcoal production is set to double by 2050. So currently 1.4 do use electricity and other fuels such as LPG, and in urban areas only 4% use electricity respectively, and yet 74% have access to electricity. So the military, state and business and elite involvement in charcoal production creates a disincentive for the top-down strategies for clean fuel adoption. And there is also that perception that electricity is too expensive for cooking, and that is deeply embedded in society. Yeah, I think to the next slide. So there are opportunities for e-cooking in Uganda. Electrification and generation capacity have continued to accelerate. So as mentioned, the total capacity has doubled from 600 megawatts to 1,200 within the past 10 years. And the good thing is that electricity normally mainly comes from renewable sources such as hydropower. But now they've increased to thermal and solar as well. There is also a significant investment in generation capacity to mitigate the dependency on hydropower. And there's also a sizable and well-financed solar home system sector, which could lay the foundation for future profitable business models for off-grid e-cooking. And also there's energy efficient appliances that are highly compatible with Ugandan cuisine, in particular the electric pressure cooker, as mentioned with my colleagues, that it is a really interesting appliance that can drastically reduce energy consumption for any energy intensive dishes. And there are also policies that are looking to integrate clean cooking and electricity access. So yeah, I think that's it from me, and I think we move on to Benin.
So Susan, are you with us?
Yes.
I can see you.
1 second.
Okay, we can hear you too. Over to you.
You can hear me. That's fabulous. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining into our today's session. Yeah, Benin. First of all, I have to thank you to the great GIZ local team in Benin who helped us tremendously with a country study, because Benin is not an immediate MECS focus country. So thank you to Guillaume and Mario and his team. So that was a great collaboration. Yeah, just a few general observations at the beginning. So where are we in terms of clean cooking and energy access in Benin? So generally, Benin has very low electrification rates, and they're slightly below the sub-Saharan African average, which leaves around 6.5 million people in Benin without electricity access. And the estimation is that 10 million do not have access to clean cooking of some sort. There are a lot of clean cooking initiatives or have been emerging over the last couple of years, but they were mainly focused on improved cook stoves. So there's also an EnDev program, for example, that's focusing on rural and peri-urban areas. Another factor that's important to mention here is that Benin has a relatively high poverty rate. So the poverty line is around $1.90 a day in the purchasing power parity. According to the World Bank, these are figures from 2019, so they might have risen a bit, but yeah, it's still very low. But we have also seen GDP growth rates between 5 and 6% in Benin, which is clearly above the sub-Saharan African average. In terms of the electricity market, it must be mentioned that most of the electricity is imported, and it's a highly fossil fuel base, so over 95% come from oil. So that's the situation. So that leads to a very low uptake in e-cooking at the moment for various reasons, even among those who are electrified, which is a big untapped potential in the country. So we currently estimate that the uptake is below 2% of electric cooking currently. So This leads to a high use of charcoal, like in many other countries facing similar challenges, which leads to deforestation and has really bad health impacts. So that's clearly one potential driver for the electric cooking in Benin, to look at these two dimensions. So what are the challenges for clean cooking? So maybe, John, you could go to the next slide. Yeah. Based on the fact that most of the power is imported, Benin has a relatively high energy price. So, you know, you heard the $1.90. The kilowatt hour is around
Yeah, I think we may have lost Susan. Let me just give her a few seconds to see if she comes back.
Sorry, I'm back.
Okay,
Patchy connection today. We have very bad weather here. Sorry. Then in general, it's a bit hen and egg. So we have very nascent e-cooking market. That's not helpful either, although it's slowly emerging, also thanks to some initiatives of GIZ and the EnDev program. We have the poverty problem and the affordability problem, not only linked to the electricity, but also to the devices. A very low consumer awareness of e-cooking in Benin, and a lot of power outages and low grid reliability that also affects devices and doesn't make it attractive for consumers. However, there's light and there are a lot of opportunities to promote or for the take-up of e-cooking in Benin. Thank you, John. So one is the rising charcoal prices, and the government has identified this, the deforestation and the need for sustainable charcoal as a big opportunity. So there are programs going on with this regard. We also see a relatively high interest in e-cooking among certain groups of consumers, especially in the higher income areas. And our surveys and also the surveys of the colleagues in Benin have shown that the cuisine in Benin is relatively suitable for electric cooking appliances, because there's a lot of like cooked beans and things like that. So there's not a high proportion of fried foods like in other areas. So that's definitely a positive driver. We also see an improving situation with regard to power outages. So the grid reliability is increasing. And we see also an emerging pay-go technology. So a lot is coming over from the solar home system sector that has been pushed by various initiatives, and that has a positive impact for e-cooking, also in terms of unlocking carbon finance potentially in the future, for example. So that is definitely a positive driver. So the glass is not half empty, it's half full if we look at that perspective. So definitely a good potential in the higher income urban areas to address the e-cooking topic among those consumers in higher income levels. Yeah, the issue is with regard to the modeling. Is there one slide, John, or was that it?
That's the last slide, yeah.
Okay, then just a quick word about the modeling, then I'm done. The problem is, in terms of carbon emissions, is that Benin has a relatively high share of fossil fuels. So we calculated that a shift towards e-cooking wouldn't bring major improvements in terms of reducing carbon emissions. That might change in the future if more renewable energy is installed in the country, and that's a clear goal of the Beninese government. But at the moment, the carbon emission is definitely not a big impact factor. However, if we look at gender, and if we look at the health impact in transitioning from biomass cooking towards e-cooking, there's significant potential that has been identified in the modeling. So yeah, glass half full, I would say. Thank you, John. Over to you.
Thanks, Susan. So over to Richard Steve next for Ethiopia.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm going to give the presentation on Ethiopia. So perhaps one way that Ethiopia is slightly different to some of the countries that we've been working with is that there is a long history of electric cooking in Ethiopia, which dates back to the 1970s, when national government programs promoted electric cooking appliances, particularly electric mitads to cook injera, to create demand for surplus power and to reduce the environmental impacts of biomass. Despite this long history, 96% of Ethiopia's population still rely on polluting fuels for their cooking needs, mostly firewood. But over the last decade, there has been a rapid increase in the use of electricity for cooking, particularly in urban areas. And it's perhaps surprising that given the very low Ethiopian electricity prices, so it's 0.015 US dollars per kilowatt hour, that's on band 2, the second lowest tariff, where we see electric cooking falling under. So despite these low prices and ongoing support from government programs, only 4.1% of households currently use electricity as their primary cooking fuel. However, there are significant opportunities to increase uptake of e-cooking, particularly as the government has ambitious plans to increase electricity access from 45% to 100% by 2025, so slightly earlier than, as you can see on that graph. And so the main recommendations to help unlock and to increase this uptake of electric cooking are the coverage and reliability of the grid needs to improve. Policy needs to better integrate electrification and clean cooking, and have a greater focus on electric cooking generally, as there's still quite a lot of emphasis on biomass and improved cook stoves. And improved access to financing could help increase the affordability of electric stoves. Yeah, next slide, please. So the graph on the right shows the breakdown of current fuel use for cooking. As you can see, there was a considerable challenge as polluted fuels still account for most of cooking in Ethiopia, particularly firewood, which accounts for 82% of the population's fuel uses for cooking. As already discussed, there was a range of social, economic and health impacts to this use of firewood. So in Ethiopia, it accounts for 63,000 premature deaths per year from indoor air pollution. And there are also deforestation and environmental degradation impacts from the use of biomass for cooking. Yeah, next slide, please. So despite the high use of biomass, there are still considerable opportunities for electric cooking in Ethiopia. So as I mentioned before, approximately 4% of households use electric cooking, half of those exclusively. And in urban areas, electricity has become the second most used fuel. 65% of households in the capital own electric appliances, and 63% use it as their primary cooking stove. So urban areas are likely to be the key market segment, and we see opportunities is greater there than in rural areas because existing usage of electric cooking appliances is higher than rural households, and because of the greater access to the grid electricity. In addition, fuel stacking in Ethiopian households has become a major coping practice to fluctuations in the price of biomass and LPG, and that has also led to an increase in electric cooking. Lastly, by looking at things from an integrated electrification and clean cooking perspective, looking at it from this perspective reveals there are more opportunities as electricity access stands at 45%, but only currently 44% of those people with electricity access are using it for electric cooking. So this suggests that 41% of the population could use electric cooking, but are currently not doing so. Although some of those groups have tier 1 connections which couldn't support electric cooking. As mentioned before, the cost of grid electricity is very low at 0.015 US dollars per kilowatt hour. And the grid is almost entirely renewable, mainly hydropower, although there are notable reliability issues from this dependency on hydropower. Next slide, please.
That's the end, I'm afraid, Richard. There were 4, but I condensed them to 3.
Oh, okay.
What you want to say?
I was just going to say I was going to summarise the challenge, the opportunities and the barriers, but also maybe just to emphasize the cost opportunity in that cooking exclusively on electricity would cost a household just under $2 per month. That would be 1.6 times cheaper than kerosene, 1.8 times cheaper than firewood if purchased, 4.5 times cheaper than LPG, and 6 times cheaper than charcoal. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Richard. So unfortunately, Carlos, who led the study in Mozambique, is not able to join us today, so I'm going to present the findings of that study. I'm going to go quite quickly because I'm conscious of time. So in Mozambique, I think the most interesting thing we found was that there's actually already, like in Ethiopia, an emerging electric cooking sector with around 1.4% of Mozambicans already using electricity as their primary cooking fuel. Similar to Ethiopia, there's a low electricity tariff, not quite as low as Ethiopia, but a very generous lifeline allowance. Again, reliability and access causing challenges to further uptake. And we really recommend a more detailed study of the e-cooking market in urban areas involving primary research, because like Benin, Mozambique is not one of the MECS focused countries. So we had to rely very heavily on the EnDev Mozambique team, who are already pursuing electric cooking opportunities and understand the market context a lot better than we do. Again, like many of the other countries, heavy reliance on biomass, and only a small proportion using modern fuels, but a significant portion of that being made up of electric cooking users. A big proportion of Mozambican electricity is from hydropower, but what we learned from the engagement with local EnDev and GIZ teams was that actually this is quite regionally dependent. A lot of the hydropower is exported to South Africa, and some power, especially for the south, in the south of the country, to Maputo and other major cities, is imported from South Africa, which is heavily coal-based. So we see that there is a huge hydropower potential in Mozambique, only some of which has been exploited so far. So there is the potential to increase that and to even out that supply of renewable electricity across the country. Also worthy of note is that their proximity to other countries where electric cooking is already mainstream technology. So Zimbabwe and Zambia, where there's around 10 to 20% of the population already using electricity as a primary cooking fuel, and South Africa, which is the only sub-Saharan African nation where the majority of the population already cook primarily with electricity. So on to the next section, which is the emerging trends. So cutting across the different country studies. I'm going to pass over briefly to Matt, who's going to give us some insight from the impact modelling.
Great, thanks, John. Yeah, so this is an example of the impact analysis outputs showing the monetized costs and benefits of the transition scenario in Kenya, just as one example that we modelled with BarHap. And BarHap likes to show everything in terms of these monetized costs and benefits. Costs on the y-axis are in millions of US dollars, and below the line, those are costs. And the main one here in pink is the subsidy payments that governments are making towards the purchase of electric cooking devices. And the benefits are the ones above the x-axis, and they're large. Household fuel expenditure in white is reducing as the cost of electricity for cooking is lower than the cost of charcoal. There are climate benefits shown here in the darker blue color, time savings in the mid blue, and health benefits from monetization of reductions in healthy years of life lost. So overall, the net social benefit is large and positive of this scenario for e-cooking in Kenya. And we've got similar details and discussion of those in the reports for each country. Could I have the next slide, John, please? This table outlines the scenarios modelled and assembles some of the key physical impacts across the 8 countries. I'm not going through all of this detail, clearly, but it's there in the reports if you want to see them in more detail later. The numbers here are normalised to per million households, and darker green basically shows larger benefit. Just one example comparison for this table, looking at the third row of numbers. As seen earlier, Bangladesh has quite a high share of fossil fuel generation, but that's mainly natural gas. And the modelling shows that e-cooking still offers greenhouse gas reductions compared to use of firewood. but those benefits are not as high as for the countries with very high shares of renewables, like Kenya, Uganda, and Nepal, and hence the per million households numbers shown in the table reflect those differences. The only negative result shown here on this table is for Benin, where the greenhouse gas emissions are higher than under the baseline due to the very high share of fossil fuels in power generation that you heard about earlier. There's clearly too much to take in here in the time available, so we've drawn out just a few key messages in the following 2 slides. So if you could advance that, John. So in terms of some clusters of countries based on the scenarios modelled and the local conditions, the first cluster of 5 at the top here, we looked at grid-connected households using charcoal for cooking. All of the countries have relatively clean power generation mixes and relatively low electricity tariffs. And for all of these countries, the results showed very large benefits across the range of impact categories. For Nepal and Bangladesh, we looked instead at transition away from firewood. And again, very large benefits, but in this case, because we're substituting for firewood, we led to even larger health benefits in terms of reduced indoor air quality. Improved indoor air quality. And then my final slide, John, please. And then our final sort of collection really is for Benin, which is this outlier. Again, we looked at grid-connected charcoal users, but the evidence is that much of the charcoal in Benin is sustainably sourced, so there were rather low deforestation benefits. And power generation, as we've heard, is heavily dependent on fossil fuels, so we saw increases in greenhouse gas emissions. There's more detail on the scenarios and the impacts and their interpretation in each of the country reports that the link John gave earlier. And now I'll pass back to John, who's going to go on, I think, and look at comparisons between the countries for a number of the key trends that affect the opportunities for e-cooking and the recommendations that come from those.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, so just conscious of time, we'll also refer you to the blog that was linked at the start of the chat. I will repost it at the end for those that may have joined partway through. This cross-country comparison is explained in detail in there, so I'll skim over it now so we can save enough time for questions and discussion at the end, as there's already been a vibrant debate in the chat. So if you haven't opened that up yet, please do and engage. And so looking at these little plots that are in the top left of all of the country studies, then I've grouped together Kenya, Nepal, Rwanda, Bangladesh and Uganda as countries where the majority of the population is now electrified, yet the majority still cook with polluting fuels. So these are the countries where the conditions are really ripe for a large-scale transition, and by developing consumer awareness, the supply chains and the enabling environment for electric cooking, we can hope to have large-scale impact in a relatively short amount of time. So looking at the electricity generation mix, then the countries on the left, Kenya, Rwanda and Uganda, we think are particularly favourable because they have a diversified mix of renewable energy generation and surplus reliable electricity available. And so in these countries, we recommend supporting the utility to develop or to scale up their electric cooking demand stimulation programs, and to leverage carbon finance to mitigate the upfront costs of energy efficient electric appliances. Looking at these commercialized polluting fuels, so we see that in Rwanda, Kenya, Ethiopia, Benin, Uganda and Mozambique, there are substantial market segments where people are paying for polluting fuels, notably charcoal and kerosene. And it's really important to carry out detailed market research to understand how much people are paying for these fuels and how frequently they're paying, to make sure that any appliance financing schemes are designed with that in mind, using that difference between the cost of cooking with those polluting fuels and the cost of cooking with electricity, which in most of those countries is lower, although I'll come back to that in several other in a few slides time. So referring to the MECS eCooking Global Market Assessment, which is a study we first did in 2017, and we redid in 2021. You can find the study itself on the MECS website. There is a link here, but a better link is to take the one in the blog that I linked to earlier. That one has an overview of the study, which looked at all low and middle income countries and ranked the countries according to how well they scored for grid connected, mini grid and off grid electric cooking, And what we see is 3 countries standing out in particular above the rest, where you see Nepal, Kenya and Bangladesh scored very highly overall for all types of electric cooking. Uganda also scoring well, Rwanda and Ethiopia, all 3 of those countries all scoring much better in off-grid than the mini-grid and grid-connected scenarios. So please do dive in for further detail on the global market assessment, which has a much broader range of countries than the set of 8 that we studied here in the EnDev MECS, deeper but less broad eCooking market assessments. So in terms of the policy environment, we're really excited by Nepal in particular, who have already developed and enforced a strong integrated policy. But we're also excited by Kenya, Uganda and Ethiopia, who are starting to join the dots between clean cooking and electricity access. There's a key role here for development partners to support the development of this integrated policy, as Verena and colleagues at EnDev Kenya, Walter and Anna are doing together in Kenya to develop the electric cooking strategy, which really spans the electrification and clean cooking sectors. In terms of the consumer demand, then we noted that East African countries in particular have a high prevalence of these long boiling dishes, which really benefit from the efficiency savings of insulation, pressurization and automation that you get from electric pressure cookers in particular. So we really recommend promoting electric pressure cookers as part of a clean fuel or clean appliance stack alongside other electric appliances or other clean fuels. So in terms of the supply chain, and Ethiopia was the only country where we saw domestic manufacturing of electric cooking, but we did note that there's already widespread adoption of rice cookers in Nepal and Bangladesh, and of electric cooking appliances in urban Mozambique. So supporting these domestic manufacturers to extend their operations into energy efficient appliances, for example, with an innovation challenge fund, or supporting the network of importers and distributors who are already supplying electrical cooking appliances to reach out to low-income households with innovative consumer financing models, for example, with a targeted results-based financing program, is a key role for development partners. So looking at the relative costs, then we see in 5 of the 8 countries, then electricity, cooking all your food with electricity, is already the cheapest way to cook, even though many people don't believe it is. So developing consumer awareness campaigns to tackle this common misperception that electricity is too expensive for cooking, and developing consumer financing mechanisms to break down what is still a high upfront cost of energy efficient appliances are important roles that could be played. So to conclude, the key takeaways from this analysis are that the clean cooking challenge and the state of the electricity access sector, and therefore the opportunity presented by electric cooking, is different in each country that we studied. However, there are some similarities and therefore similar interventions that can be effective in countries with similar characteristics. There are opportunities for electric cooking in all of the countries that we studied. However, Nepal, Rwanda, Kenya, Uganda and Ethiopia stand out as contexts where we see a rapid transition that could happen at scale if the right support is there. So this could make a substantial contribution to SDG 7 by leveraging progress in electrification to drive forward the clean cooking agenda. So I'd like to thank you for listening, point you to the MECS website and the EnDev websites, where you can find the full set of 8 electric cooking market assessments, the cross-country comparison in more detail, and the impact modelling methodology that Matt has mentioned, and the guiding framework for the study. So I'd like to pass back over to the EnDev team now for the Q&A session. And thank you to everyone for your engagement, and thank you to my co-presenters from the MECS team.
Yeah, thank you, John. And also thanks to the MECS team, everybody who presented, and also colleagues, everybody who contributed. I think this was really, really a lot of information. Fortunately, everything is available also online. I think on the EnDev website, you might have to wait for 1 or 2 more days, but you'll find it there. Let's now focus on your questions and reactions, both in the chat, but also feel free to raise your hand. I see the list of participants here. If you raise your hand, we'll also give you the floor to speak. And while you're thinking about maybe a question or a comment, I would like to hand over to Simone, who has kept an overview of the chat where a lot of questions were raised already.
Yes, a lot of questions were raised and a lot of questions were already answered by the MECS team. So thank you for that. Maybe for the time waiting for maybe some verbal contribution by colleagues. I know if I see a hand from Rhea. If we should give the word to Rhea first.
Okay, fine, Rhea.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for letting me go first. I didn't mean to steal the show. But I was very interested to see this study about the feasibility of cooking on a solar home system in Malawi. But that leads to my follow-up question. If there's any information about the real feasibility and what it would cost to do e-cooking on solar home systems in Kenya, Uganda, or Tanzania, where I think the PEGO markets are the most developed. And if there hasn't been a study on that, if there's thinking about it or what the general feeling is about the actual feasibility of entering e-cooking on the solar home system market. Thanks.
And thank you, Rhea, for that question. John and team, I hope it's okay. Maybe we can take one more question and then you answer both of them. There's a hand raised by Nish Chai.
Many thanks for the presentation. It was really interesting. And hi, I'm also from the Energy Project in GIZ ESTS. We work closely also in Uganda, Kenya, and Ethiopia. I was just interested in knowing that if any, in the initial feasibility studies, if focus has also been given to the operation and maintenance and the e-waste and producer responsibility in that aspect, if you have any comments. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Yeah, let's take these two questions to start. And John, please go on.
Okay, I'll take a first stab and then allow any other colleagues who may want to come in to add. So in response to Rhea's question about e-cooking on solar home systems, then we have a report that we published with colleagues at ESMAP that Professor Leach also worked on, which looked at the relative cost of cooking on grid-connected, mini-grid and off-grid systems. So we have a case study from Kenya, which is a pilot project that's happening at the moment out in Nakuru County, where there are 20 households who are trialing solar home systems sized for cooking. So the economics are more challenging than grid-connected electric cooking. It's more an early piloting stage, but it is definitely possible to power especially energy efficient electric appliances such as electric pressure cookers via off-grid systems and using battery storage to be able to cook at night time. I'm also going to refer you to the MECS website where there is a blog by our colleagues in Malawi who have written up their approach to designing around the financial constraints of their consumers and the preferences for cooking experience in Malawi. They work very closely with a range of women's groups and have really innovated in the off-grid direct drive approach in terms of connecting a solar panel directly to a DC cooking appliance, which really brings the cost down substantially. On to Nishai's question about O&M and e-waste. Again, I would like to refer you to the MECS website. I'll put a link into the chat to a blog that was written by our partner, Anne Washera of Strathmore University, who is conducting an analysis of the quality, repair and maintenance systems in Kenya specifically, looking at what's happened with other products such as solar home systems and other appliances, and trying to explore what needs to be done whilst e-cooking is still at a small, relatively small scale, to ensure that these issues are adequately addressed if we are successful in getting e-cooking to go to scale. So whilst I look for those blogs, or if perhaps the comms team are more quicker at doing it than I will pass over to any other colleagues from the MECS team who may want to add to what I've said.
Could I just jump in and add very briefly, in terms of operation and maintenance costs and also replacement costs at the end of appliance lifetimes, those were included in the impact analysis modelling that we did. So the costs that you see reported include those elements, but they don't include anything about the management of devices at end of life. And I would also suggest that our colleague Jackie Lee in the MECS programme takes a life cycle perspective, a life cycle analysis perspective to eCooking. And has got a number of papers and blogs on the MECS website relevant to kind of thinking about a life cycle perspective, including end of life kind of issues. So you might find something useful there.
Thank you, Matt, for this, and John as well. There's no hand raised at the moment. Simone, is there any interesting question in the chat?
Yeah, maybe I can pick up the question raised by Noah. He's asking about minimum energy performance standards for eCooking. Are there any countries that have like such standards already in place?
Yeah, that's a good question. I personally am not aware of any countries that have them in place already, but I know the CLASP team are working closely with national standards organizations in Bangladesh, and I think also in India as well, to develop those kind of standards. They've done similar things before with other appliances such as refrigerators and water pumps, and now looking at what needs to be done to transfer that into the world of electric cooking.
Okay, thank you, John. There are two hands raised. Let's start with Sevi from Ethiopia.
Thank you, Verena. This is Zodi, supporting the cooking energy interventions with EnDev Ethiopia. We're actually at the moment working closely with the Minister of Water and Energy through the Ethiopia Energy Authority. They have come up with the MEPS, focusing on the electric metad, which is the Jera baking stove. So we are currently working with them to help promote and raise the awareness and the standards across the value chain for both suppliers as well as the end users. It is just a new thing, but we're hoping also the outcomes of the eCooking study we just completed will also help to feed light into that and get that more actively on the ground for manufacturers to be bringing their technologies, as well as to raise their awareness on the benefits of the MEPS and the technologies associated with said MEPS. So we'll be able to share more information on that as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you for this announcement, and it's really interesting to hear this coming up, and we'll look forward to hear more from you in the future. Thank you very much. There's another hand raised by Ben Campbell.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to be again in the conversation of the wonderful MECS program people, and great to hear these results coming through. And my question was to I posted, and I think Melinda said she couldn't access the chat or something, but so it was about the slide from Bangladesh about hesitancy due to socio-cultural perceptions. And because I know Melinda is something of an expert on socio-cultural issues, I wonder, could she elaborate on what kinds of it's pretty broad socio-cultural perceptions. So could you specify or elaborate, please?
Yeah, sorry, thanks, Ben. John had shared the question, and I'd sent a message, but I don't think he'd managed to pick it up yet, saying that I would email you separately, given that we chat. No, so apologies that didn't get to you. I don't know why I can't access this. Yeah, so, perhaps sociocultural, given we're both anthropologists, isn't necessarily the right broad label under which to put it, but there have been a lot of negative perceptions around the convenience of modern energy cooking appliances or the usability. There have been issues of negative perceptions around cost and affordability. However, there are a couple of reports on the MECS website, and I'm happy to send those links to you, around work that's been done by UIU and also Practical Action in Dakar. And after doing sort of pilot cooking diaries with various electrical appliances, showing a transition towards perceptions with people, or at least respondents, mentioning that previously, the issues or concerns around safety are now being are less worrisome, or that they found that these, excuse me, the ease of use and the convenience, again, perceptions that or the learnability that they had considered would be a barrier aren't so big or aren't so worrisome again. As I said already in the presentation, cost is an issue that was mentioned, but research has shown by UIU that actually cost of e-cooking is less than other forms. So yeah, just those sort of latent perceptions around usability, convenience, affordability, learnability, safety, yeah. But as I say, we could have a debate whether they should all be called social cultural or just social. But yes, those are the perceptions that I was talking about. And happy to talk more, Ben.
Thanks, Linda. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much. So a call for more awareness creation and behavior change communication, definitely. Thank you very much. So unfortunately, our time is coming to an end. I imagine there might be more, appetite for exchange and discussion. You find the studies online. You know where to find John, Simone, Gregor, myself, to reach out to and to further raise your questions. Also, please let us know if you have more interest in more exchange on this topic. Then we are happy to organize that also in the course of the year. So thank you very much to all the participants, to the MECS team, to everybody who contributed to these studies and to these findings. I don't know, John, if you want to have a final word, then otherwise I would make a short announcement at the end of the call. But before I do that, I give you also a final word.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who contributed to this huge body of work. And it's great to see so much excitement. The chat, it's been difficult to keep up with it. So I really hope there is further exchange. We are very excited to continue collaborating with the broad EnDev team and to really work together to realize this potential that we see in so many countries around the world. So thank you to Verena, Simona, Gregor for the invitation to be a part of what you're doing. And we really are excited by the opportunity that you see to connect clean cooking and electrification together.
Thank you, John. So this is like a starting point probably for much more to come.